birth of ambient music might have happened 100 years before ambient music. And that's because of one French composer named Eric Satie. Chances are, if you've been on TikTok or Instagram Reels or anything like that recently, you may have heard this. And that piece is, of course, Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1. I have no clue if that's the correct pronunciation, but it was written in 1888, and it wasn't long after that, in 1917, that Satie actually coined a term, furniture music. That's kind of a funny way to describe it, but here's what he meant. Musique d'amblement was a term used to describe music that wasn't meant to be listened to. It was literally meant to just be there, like furniture in the room. In fact, he was so serious about this that he actually got frustrated when people would pay attention to his compositions. He wanted people to ignore them and just have the compositions be present as people went about their business. And while the first Gymnopédie is probably his most popular work that many of us are familiar with, he actually wrote a series of 5 short pieces that were specifically meant to fit into this musique d'amblement genre that he was developing. And they're really interesting. Like, take this one, for example. That's it. That's the whole piece. That's literally the whole thing. Now, these 5 pieces were each written for different purposes. This one specifically was written as a greeting. It was a grand entrance. It's meant for the arrival of guests. And it's just these 4 bars in 6/8 that go around and around and around again. And it's funny, because this actually kind of brings up an interesting point about Satie himself. He was, dare I say, the original troll. He's like the internet 100 years before the internet. I mean, this dude was nuts. And there's a great video by Weird History that actually outlines some of these eccentricities that Satie was well known for and probably infamous for. Things like having a bizarre schedule and having a very strange diet. He was a member of a cult until he got kicked out of that cult. So he formed his own religion, and he was the only member of that religion. He wrote a piece that was designed to be repeated 840 times. There's a video of, it's literally a 12-hour video. I don't actually know if it took 12 hours to get through all 840 repeats of this, but it's not exactly something that's, dare I say, beautiful to play 840 times in a row. Check it out. Yeah. Okay. Very cool. Very cool. And then we get into the actual harmony. Yeah, so I mean, dude, this 840 times. I mean, a lot of people ask the question, like, was this even serious, or was this just some giant troll? Because with Satie, it's like, you kind of don't know which way it could have gone. But one of the fascinating things about this whole idea of furniture music and a lot of Satie's legacy is that it actually paved the way for ambient music almost 100 years later. I mean, let's check out Brian Eno's Ambient 1 Music for Airports, because this is absolutely fascinating. In 1978, Brian Eno made this album, and it was an exploration in experimentation in this ambient style, and you can actually hear a lot of interesting similarities. Was that literally the melody? Almost. Not quite, but I mean, we get right there. I mean, this is just absolutely beautiful, and you can hear the influence. Wow. Yeah. You know, I mean, it's 1978. Gymnopédie was written in 1888, so this is 90 years later, and definitely there is some influence from Satie here. Satie also had an influence on so many different people, including Bill Evans. I mean, come on. Tell me that's not directly coming out of Satie. Everybody Digs Bill Evans came out in 1959, and Peace Peace, I mean, it literally just sounds like, it sounds almost the same. I mean, the harmony's a little different, but this concept of playing a root note and then a chord. I mean, Peace Peace, if we listen to that, this is so beautiful, and it is that sort of furniture music in a lot of ways. Now, I don't think Bill Evans wrote Peace Peace or performed Peace Peace with the intention of nobody listening to it, but it has that same type of feel where it could just be in the background. Now, this is such an interesting concept for musicians because typically we don't play music that is intended to be ignored. We don't really want people to come in and just not pay any attention to the things that we're playing. But Satie had a different approach. Up until that point, the Romantic era, the Impressionist era leading to the turn of the century, music had never been written with the intention of being ignored. That just wasn't something that anyone had done. Why would they? But Satie was like, nuh-uh. I want to create something that literally just sets the tone of a room. It just creates a vibe, creates a feel, but is designed to just sit there in the background. We have a tendency to take music that was not meant for that and turn it into music that's used for that. But this was the first time that music had ever been written with the intention of being a background. And the results are absolutely fascinating. They're super interesting. And I think this example, this 4 bars of 6/8 that's just meant to be repeated endlessly, harmonically, there's some really interesting things going on there. That second phrase sounds like it's an emergence, an opening of something, like, which makes sense because if this is meant to be a reception of guests, it's like a greeting. It feels like a greeting. It's this second part. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? It feels like a sort of emerging hopefulness. This is the whole thing. That's it. It's just this over and over and over again. It's one of those things where you almost listen to it and you're like, man, it kind of like fades into the background of your mind. Imagine being the musicians tasked with playing this. I mean, that's got to be absolutely horrifying because when you get into things like that where it's just constant repetition and you're just doing the same thing over and over again, it actually becomes really difficult and almost easy to lose your place and mess up because your brain starts to kind of like shut off all of a sudden. I mean, you know how like you can be driving and you kind of like you forget that you exist for a period of time and all of a sudden you snap out of it and you go, I don't remember the last 3 miles that I drove. You can do that same thing with music, and like music like this, that's really easy to have that happen and all of a sudden you lose your place and you screw up. So it actually is a lot more difficult than you might think to perform something like this effectively. But the fact that it's just written this way where it's like 4 bars, that's it, 4 bars over and over again endlessly. Whoa, I mean, what a concept. And during the experimental phases of music, we had composers like Steve Reich doing things similarly where it kind of just is meant to melt into your brain and you just sort of think of things totally differently. And you almost stop thinking about the music and you stop paying attention to it, or it becomes a part of just your mental space and it's not even something that you're necessarily paying attention to the specific notes. It's almost impossible to because it sounds like this. Wow, okay, yeah, there's 2 pianos here. One tempo is phasing out of sync with the other piano. It's like the tempos are slightly shifting on one, but staying the same with it. I mean, unbelievably interesting thing to listen to, but you don't listen to this the same way that you would listen to Clair de Lune or something like that. It's not meant to be consumed in the same way, and this was Satie's exact approach with Musique d'Emblement. It was not meant to be focused on, it was meant to fade into the background of a situation. Now, this particular example, I don't know that it's necessarily supposed to fade into the background, but we certainly hear it differently than we hear normal music. It's something where you can't necessarily pay attention to every individual thing going on here. If I just play this over and over and over again, I'm not gonna hear every individual note as a melody. It's not really a melody, it's just a sound, right? And especially when we start combining all these interesting rhythms and then the two pianos at different tempos phasing in and out, it just becomes an experience. You almost have to let your brain stop hearing it as music like you're supposed to pay attention to it and just hear it as a wall of sound that is affecting you in some way. And there's so much music that is like this, that is fascinating to listen to. And I think whether we're talking about this type of stuff or the Brian Eno, more ambient music, it all has that idea of a different consumption of music that's not meant to be the focal point. Or at least the melodies and the harmonies are not meant to be the focal point. And in many ways, Satie in 1888 set the stage for this. So much of his work is absolutely fascinating, and clearly was an inspiration for so many composers and musicians over the next 100 years to experiment with the ideas that he sort of set forth in the late 1800s. As bizarre as he might have been as a person, I think we can all be grateful that he had these weird tendencies of writing music, because we got some really interesting things out of the groundwork that his legacy laid, and how people later took that and developed it into all kinds of incredible music. That's gonna be all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.